A few weeks ago, every day we fight, a new turn-based tactics game has seen its early access release, offering a very creative gameplay experience, and today we're going to break it down and look at it for what it is at this point in time. If you've played turn-based tactics games before, you'll be quite familiar with most mechanics you'll find on average in the genre, from managing a team, developing their skills and gear, to how combat works with action points and some sort of Overwatch ability, all of it. So when Montreal-based developer Signal Space Lab came up with the idea and concept for a new tactics game, I'm pretty sure they spent a great deal of time figuring out how to make the game their own, because there's quite a few interesting things going on. Last 10 seconds before we get started, I'm basing this launch review on the build after update number 5, which you can check out by the way if you want to see the details over on Steam, on the store page for Every Day We Fight. I've spent about 15 hours with the game, so I've taken into account the first bug fixes and patches. There won't be any major spoilers in this review in terms of the story. Now, if you think afterwards this review helped you out, then you should totally subscribe to the channel, of course, if you haven't done so already, because there will be more previews and reviews to follow. And with that out of the way, let's get to it. In Every Day We Fight, you manage a team of resistance fighters in the aftermath of a global invasion by aliens known as Rifters. They showed up after a great World War I-like event, and with this being the context of events, it's not unimaginable to think quite a number of people will make a comparison to games such as XCOM or Phoenix Point. However, I feel it would be unfair to say this is just another XCOM clone, because the game definitely has its own character in terms of art design and has a lot of features that set it apart from other turn-based tactics games. One of the major features is that it works with time loops. Essentially, what happens when the entire team dies is you start all over again in a new loop. And hearing me say when your entire team dies instead of if might pique your interest, since we all know the feeling when you're playing a tactics game that you care about your team members, and your worst fear, or at least mine is permanently losing your best ones because of the amount of time you've put into getting them safely through missions and developing their skills. But this is where another big feature of what makes this game stand out comes in, which is the fact that the time loop concept is not just part of the story, but gameplay wise it's a clever way to introduce a roguelite system. Like I said, if the team gets wiped, your team members lose all of their gear, but they keep their XP levels and previously unlocked skills. So in other words, meta progression. Now this has both a big benefit, which is the preservation of your team and all of the TLC you've put into it, but it also has what seems to be like a huge drawback in that you have to redo the previous missions you just completed in the story act you are currently in, but I'll give that some nuance in just a bit. In the first few hours playing, I found this correlation between the story element and gameplay feature working out really well as the game unfolded, although it took me some time to pinpoint what the looping means for players in terms of the fun factor. So it becomes clear quite fast that your entire team dying is the intended and natural part of progression in the game. Now I'm already hinting at mission difficulty here, and you can guess it needs to be pretty high in order to guarantee that players will at least once fail the mission depending on their level of progress. Which brings me to the missions. Missions take place at fixed points in the city that forms the game world, and they have the classic design where you have to protect a certain objective, reach a certain location, or defeat any number of enemies. We've all seen this before. It's not so much the structure that stands out in this game, it's the difficulty. Now in some games there will be a time when you come across a mission that's simply hard and it will take several attempts to overcome it. Some people find that annoying, others will like the challenge and the sense of reward it gives you once you do manage to make it out on top. But failure is inevitable here, and the game can go in overkill mode pretty quickly. Early on in the game you'll encounter these grenadiers. They have armor, shields and hard-hitting weapons. They can take out one of your team members in one turn with ease by either mag dumping into them or throwing a grenade, and once one of your team members goes down, 9 out of 10 times it goes downhill from there pretty quickly. Now the other 1 out of 10 times it's possible to clutch it with your remaining character, but that mostly comes down to luck. Now, I have to say this is all pretty easily adjustable for the devs in terms of balancing with damage tables, ultimately trying to find that sweet spot between the game being challenging or frustrating. So while the game can feel really hard when you're just starting out, but that's because of the difficulty and the fact that it's being balanced towards you failing, as opposed to other games where there needs to be a certain probability of players making it through a mission without losing everyone. So knowing this, the difficulty might be challenging but fair overall. And also it's a tactics game, and at some point you'll figure out how to prioritize enemies and quickly take down grenadiers, so it becomes easier as you go along, helped further by the meta progression. Signal Space Lab also come up with some pretty cool variants of combat mechanics. In combat, the game utilizes a commonly known system of having a certain number of action points per character you get to spend on various actions. When you decide to fire at enemies, you then enter a first-person mode, allowing you to aim your weapon at an enemy. This is a cool alternative to a stats and percentage-based system where you end up being dependent on RNG, so the system requires you, or this system requires you as a player, to have some skill at aiming, because simply pointing and shooting, they already obviously thought about that, it would be boring. So they added this Max Payne style bullet time, where as soon as you fire your first shot, your target will start moving to get to cover, and you have to lead the target a bit. Now, it's not a wild new innovation, but for this genre it's a very nice twist. Enemies also have weak points to explode. Your enemies wear armor, and you can actually destroy certain pieces of it, which then allows you to deal more damage to that enemy, so the game offers some extra challenge to players in trying to be as efficient as possible in a turn. Something else that I think is really smartly designed is the reflex system. Some sort of Overwatch action has become a staple ability in turn-based tactics games, and every day we find is no exception, except for the part where they present you with a trade-off. When you choose to cover an area with Overwatch, you use up your character's reflex point in addition to some action points. You have one reflex point per character in your turn, but enemies might take a different route, evading your field of fire, and end up in a position where they can either throw a grenade at you or try to mag dump into one of your team members. Now, instead of spending your reflex point on Overwatch, you can save it and pass the turn. Then, just before an enemy will deal damage, your reflex point can be used to scramble, essentially giving you a chance to evade some or all of the damage you might take if you choose to ignore this interruption. Now, having spent a lot of time with other turn-based tactics games, I've had so many situations where I thought it would have made logical sense for a character to try and move away from the big bad alien appearing close by, trying to kill you, but there wasn't always the option to do so. So I think the scramble option adds a lot to your tactical options as you plan out each turn, enhancing the gameplay loop, and I have to say it works out really well here. In terms of the weapons you use, there isn't a whole lot of variety. There are basically 3 types of weapons: a shotgun, an SMG, and a rifle. Now, in your hideout, you'll have a random collection of weapons at the start of a new time loop, so you get to try a new approach, which I feel is a nice way to cushion having to do a couple of missions all over again without the game becoming really repetitive, or even worse, flat out boring. And you get the chance to loot alien weapons as well, giving you some extra choice in loadout. But the most enjoyment with regards to gear has to come from the weapon upgrades. Upgrades can either be found when you explore the game world, out on the streets, or inside buildings, or you can craft them. Upgrades will enhance stats, reduce AP cost, and are divided into different categories with 3 rarity tiers. Crafting them requires you to collect scrap, a resource that can be found at fixed points throughout the city, or they can be dropped by enemies when they die in combat. Personally, I think the upgrade cost can use some tweaking. For example, to make one common upgrade, it'll cost you 1,000 scrap. Now, long before you reach having 1,000 scrap, you'll be at a point in missions where you either need to have better skills or better weapons to improve your odds of passing the mission. And as it is now, it requires too much grinding for my taste to even get to a common upgrade upgrade, let alone get to a rare or epic one. Because when you take a look at epic upgrades, they're costing 5k each. Then multiply that by maybe wanting 2 upgrades per weapon times 3 characters, which amounts to a lot of grinding. Speaking of characters, each turn-based tactics game is designed differently when it comes to the units that you use. For example, XCOM works with superficial soldiers and quite a lot of them, and yes, they have a unique name, but that's all. They don't have their own unique background stories or personalities. And for Every Day We Fight, the developers chose to have 3 fixed characters, each with a unique set of skills that allows them to be complementary to one another during combat. Story-wise, these characters don't seem to have much depth, at least not from what I've seen so far, and maybe that'll change towards the end of finishing the campaign, but for me it hasn't reached the point yet where I empathize with them, and truth be told, it's kinda hard to when the fact that they die every couple of missions and it has no real impact on me as a player, because, you know, they pop back up again and you can just use them again. Now, in between missions, you'll get a few cutscenes or a script is triggered where they banter back and forth a bit, but this is mostly done after you've played through quite a number of missions already. So if you're meant to form some sort of connection with them, it makes it a bit harder in the current pacing of the story. And the same could be said for the entire story setting. Not much info is given up front about the era the game is set in, how the war that's being talked about all the time by your team started, or why it is important in your fight against the Rifters. In fact, I would argue that it has no influence on the game whatsoever, not in gameplay mechanics, enemies, world or level design, other than the art design itself. Now, it might even be a bit distracting for some people in the fact that the aliens have invaded, and players should maybe worry about that more than being reminded about a war between nations. But I think an important question here is how much of this matters to you, if at all, because the core gameplay loop is solid and the drive forward comes from leveling up, unlocking skills and improving your weapons to get through the missions easier. Now, I think you have to view the game for what it is at the moment, which is an early access release, and Signal Space Lab will use all the feedback they're getting and performance metrics, etc. to improve the game, like they have done tremendously already based on player feedback, and this is how they quickly got to 5 updates already, including a much needed manual save system, by the way, to slightly deter being set back too far in time by time loops and having to do a lot of stuff all over again. Obviously, it will take them some time to get everything settled in terms of balance, and early access is a great way for them to gather a lot of feedback to see what people think of the game and how things can be adjusted within the game's nature to ultimately let people have more fun. So the game's overall design makes it a lot of fun to play, with mechanics and systems that sets it apart from other games in the genre as a whole, and I will argue that the combat is what the majority of players and fans of the genre will be interested in, and aspects such as the overall story, how much context and depth the characters have, how it makes you care for their struggles. Getting that right will make the difference here between a good and a great game. Now, I certainly enjoyed my time playing, getting caught up in ways trying to beat the more difficult missions, and I want to see more of how the tactics will evolve once you get to unlock most of the tech trees and get to weapons with epic upgrades. That's something maybe for a review a few months down the road, or when the 1.0 release happens. For now, I hope you've enjoyed this review. Subscribe to the channel to see more, and I'll see you next time here on Game Insights. Bye everyone.